Now, European leaders are also warning U.S. President-elect Donald Trump not to invade other countries after he returns to office later this month.
My administration will be reclaiming the Panama Canal, and we've already started doing it.
Trump has said he wants the U.S. to take control of Canada, Greenland, and the Panama Canal. He also announced that he would be changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico.
Taking it back. We're going to take it back.
He just said take it back. That's a good idea.
The idea of a canal connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans dates back centuries, recognized by indigenous peoples and European explorers like Vasco Núñez de Balboa. The 19th century saw some serious attempts, most notably in 1881 when the French, led by Ferdinand de Lesseps, who built the Suez Canal, began building in Panama. An estimated 20,000 to 22,000 workers died during this time, and the French attempt failed by 1890 as a result of engineering difficulties, tropical diseases like yellow fever and malaria, and financial issues. Early in the 20th century, the United States took over management of the project. The United States acquired the authority to construct and manage the canal after the Hay-Paunce-Fote Treaty of 1901, which revoked previous accords with Britain. In 1902, the U.S. Senate decided to build the canal in Panama rather than Nicaragua. In 1903, the United States backed Panama's independence movement by sending warships to stop Colombian troops from crushing the revolt. Panama was owned by Colombia at that time, and it was essential for the USA to gain Panama's independence and then control the new Panama government through trade, diplomacy, and force. Eventually, Panama gained independence, and the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty was signed, which granted the United States a 10-mile-wide canal zone in exchange for $10 million and an annual payment. Instead of following the French plan for a sea-level canal, the United States finished the canal in 1914 using a lock-and-lake system. Significance of the Panama Canal. One of the most strategically important waterways in the world, the Panama Canal connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, enabling roughly 5 to 6% of global maritime trade by avoiding the lengthy route around Cape Horn. It is essential for the transportation of manufactured goods and raw materials, particularly for the United States, which depends on it for over 70% of its goods. It also has military strategic value, enabling the U.S. Navy to move vessels between oceans quickly. It has been a major economic catalyst for Panama, generating revenue through tolls and related industries. The Panama Canal is enshrined as an inalienable national asset under Panama's constitution, and it has been run by the Panama Canal Authority since the U.S. turned over control of it in 1999 under the Torrijos-Carter Treaties signed in 1977. American and Chinese influence on the Panama Canal. Because of its strategic and economic significance, the United States has historically controlled the canal, holding influence over it from its completion until 1999. As a result, the country has a strong interest in maintaining the canal's security and neutrality. Following Panama's 2017 decision to transfer diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China, China has been attempting to exert more influence in Panama and the canal region. As part of its Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, China made significant investments in free trade zones and port infrastructure surrounding the canal to strengthen its strategic position in Latin America. The United States has aggressively resisted Chinese influence and retaliation. Panama annulled a Chinese company's concession to run important ports close to the canal and distanced itself from the BRI. The U.S. investment giant BlackRock stepped in to end the influence of Hong Kong-based Chinese companies. It acquired the port stakes recently in 2025 to further distance China from one of the most strategic assets of the USA, rising canal fees and eroding U.S.-Panama trust. The trust that once characterized the United States-Panama relationship is gradually being undermined by the recent spike in shipping costs through the Panama Canal, which has become a major source of friction between the two countries. The Canal Authority claims that higher tolls are required for long-term sustainability in order to control ship traffic and finance water conservation in the face of Panama's frequent droughts. The United States, which depends largely on the canal for its trade routes, believes that these price hikes are unjust. While political voices, particularly those influenced by Trump, have accused Panama of mismanaging the canal and serving foreign interests, particularly Chinese ones, American corporations have voiced their displeasure over disproportionate charges. When Panama rejected American requests to waive or reduce tolls for American vessels, citing the 1977 treaty that ensures equal treatment for all nations, the situation deteriorated. Neutrality means fairness to Panama, but it appears to U.S. officials that Panama is drifting away from its long-standing alliance. Recent developments in the Panama Canal crisis. What was once a commercial corridor is being reframed as a militarized choke point within the broader U.S.-China rivalry, according to recent developments. With Trump-era Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth refusing to rule out plans to reestablish a military presence in Panama, the United States has signaled aggressive intent to reassert control over the canal under his revived America First doctrine. These statements are more than just rhetoric. They mark a substantial departure from the long-standing Torrijos-Carter treaties of 1977, which established their legal neutrality. It would be a treaty violation and cause regional criticism, as well as great power retaliation if the United States were to militarize or reoccupy the canal unilaterally. China has more financial rather than military interests in the canal, but they are still very important. China, a country that depends largely on maritime trade and is the second largest user of the canal, has made investments in logistics hubs and infrastructure across Central America. Even though China does not directly control the canal, political rhetoric from the United States that accuses China of covert control has fueled nationalist concerns and justified military posturing. Threat of a nuclear standoff. Senator Marco Rubio recently threatened that China might close the canal in the event of a conflict, a threat that has been used to intensify American preparations for contingencies. Beijing might react asymmetrically, through military buildups in other regions of greatest risk like Taiwan or the South China Sea, or trade retaliation, if Washington were to act on such presumptions. Even a small incident, such as a cyber attack or a vessel being blocked, could trigger an uncontrollable escalation towards another world war, which would be a nuclear war. Supply chain disruption. A prelude to war. In terms of geoeconomics, international trade depends on the Panama Canal. It makes up almost 40% of container traffic in the United States and more than 5% of shipping worldwide. Any disruption would result in price shocks in Europe, Asia, and the developing world, in addition to having an effect on the U.S. economy. The Canal Authority's decision to give Mediterranean Shipping Company, MSC, a concession has already increased tensions. Destabilizing contestation is encouraged if the canal starts to operate more like a strategic prize than a neutral global commons. Given the current pressures on global supply chains and ongoing trade realignments, this is particularly dangerous. The United States may face retaliatory trade sanctions, port blockades, or even proxy maritime conflicts if it decides to put strategic control ahead of economic stability. Latin America, U.S. drift. The regional fallout is equally severe. Mass protests against the perceived erosion of sovereignty have broken out in Panama, and the U.S. attempt to militarize the canal has been denounced by Latin American neighbors, who are already suspicious of U.S. intentions because of a history of interventionism. This growing backlash could realign regional alliances, attracting leftist governments into an anti-U.S. bloc and destabilizing U.S. relations throughout the Western Hemisphere. CELAC's China deal and the U.S.-China face-off, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, or CELAC, has become a major actor in the Panama Canal dispute, particularly since its Beijing summit in May 2025. China presented itself as a partner for regional growth at the meeting by pledging $9 billion in loans and development to CELAC countries. Despite withdrawing from China's Belt and Road Initiative, Panama's involvement demonstrated its willingness to accept Beijing's backing in the face of mounting American pressure. In its joint statements, CELAC denounced foreign bullying and backed the right to self-determined development, subtly opposing the U.S. push for Panama to cut back on Chinese participation in canal infrastructure. Panama has diplomatic support from this alliance to oppose U.S. demands, particularly those to abandon port projects with ties to China. Why would claiming Panama cause World War III? If the U.S. decides to exert control unilaterally, it will set a precedent for other countries to follow suit. USA's defense of Ukraine's sovereignty will be nullified, since it will be doing exactly what Russia did. This will further involve the USA in a much bigger conflict on the Ukraine and Taiwan front as well. Taiwan would be claimed by China, and so will Ukraine by Russia, leaving the USA to economically starve because of the loss of the entire semiconductor market in Taiwan, European trade through the Sevastopol coast in Ukraine, and the rare earth minerals deal to enrich and maintain a hegemony on uranium. Losing international trade partners will further frustrate the USA from considering an all-out war. Under the leadership of Trump, the USA is already hostile to such threats, and any move to further jeopardize Trump's popularity will ultimately lead to World War III. All of this takes place in a world already plagued by crises, including the Middle East crisis, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, the growing tensions in the Taiwan Strait, energy insecurity, and economic inflation. By attracting NATO allies through trade dependencies or alliance commitments, a crisis in the canal could serve as a multiplier, triggering a series of alignments and escalations. Because it captures all the elements of today's vulnerable global order, great power rivalry, economic interdependence, and regional frustration, the Panama Canal crisis could ultimately lead to a deadly war.